morning. It's my great pleasure this morning to talk to you for about 10 minutes about some of the work we've done to underpin the development of the intervention in the NoHoW trial. I would like to begin by acknowledging my academic partners within the NoHoW consortium, all of whom contributed incredibly valuable elements of this research. I would also like to acknowledge my colleagues at Newcastle, Kirby, who will be speaking after me, and Falco, who is not here at the moment, for their role in conducting this research. The point of the evidence foundation, being the bottom building block in the pile of NoHoW, is to inform the content of the weight loss maintenance intervention to be developed and to inform the design of the RCT. This includes elements such as the population we want to try and recruit, an awareness of what weight management activities they're currently undertaking, and a sense of how much weight loss is achieved in the general population and what people do to achieve it, the strategies used. There are three elements of the Work Package 1 Evidence Foundation. I'll be presenting on this first one, and Kirby will talk about the second one. I will be talking about our epidemiological survey in 2,000 European adults who are overweight or obese, about their weight loss activities. Weight loss would appear to be a European pastime. Even amongst those who are not overweight and obese, a general population systematic review of attempts to control weight amongst just ordinary people in communities suggests that almost half of individuals within countries make a weight loss attempt every year. What we don't know is how they do it and to what extent they succeed in doing it, what weight loss is achieved, what strategies they used, and of course, the million-dollar question, whether they keep it off or not. This is the other problem with weight loss. The percentage of people actually attempting to maintain weight loss, having achieved it, is much lower than those actually attempting it. Indeed, there is an absence of awareness of weight loss maintenance as an activity amongst the general population, and certainly an absence of awareness of the need to do specific things to keep weight off after it has been lost. And once again, we don't really have a clear understanding of what people try and do to keep it off. Existing surveys have been very broad and talked about general approaches, but not individual techniques. Moreover, our understanding of what works for weight loss maintenance is primarily based on highly unrealistic scenarios. So you have the randomized controlled trial. Participants join it, participants stay in it, and these individuals are not necessarily representative of the populations they serve, of normal overweight and obese people in the community. You've also got the weight loss control registry in America, which is people who've maintained weight for a very, very long time, very successfully. But again, your average person on the street maybe doesn't want to join a highly research-intensive weight control registry. So you're going to get an unrepresentative sample of people who are actually trying to manage their weight when you look at these studies. They're informative, but they don't tell us what's happening in the wild. So we need a pair of binoculars rather than a petri dish. And this involves asking people about their own activities. It also involves accepting self-reported weight data from very large samples of people, because without doing that, and without, of course, acknowledging the limitations of self-reported weight data, we're not going to get a sense of what people are doing out there in the community, out there in the wild. So the research questions we sought to answer in this first stage survey were, broadly, what do weight loss attempts actually look like? Their duration, their incidence, their success, and what was involved, what people actually did in the overweight and obese general population. What extent is weight loss actually achieved? And also, how much do people report regaining over what time period? And who seems to keep it off and who doesn't? In order to get truly nationally representative panels of individuals, which of course was one of the key points of doing this research, we worked with Ipsos Mori to develop panels in 3 countries. These individuals all completed the same survey, obviously in 3 different languages, regarding the demographics, regarding their weight loss history, so age at first weight loss attempt and number of weight loss attempts made, the strategies that they used for weight loss, any strategies they might or might not use for weight loss maintenance, how much weight they lost in their most recent attempt, how much they regained after the most recent attempt, and we asked about eating and other energy balance behaviours, including physical activity. Our participants came from Denmark, Portugal, and the UK. These were not strategically chosen countries. These were countries in which we have NoHoW investigators. However, I do feel that they quite nicely reflect a Scandinavian country, European country, Mediterranean country in Portugal, and then, of course, the UK. In terms of eligibility criteria, we wanted people who had a BMI over 25. We asked people to self-report their current weight and height and excluded those whose BMI was not over 25. We also wanted people who tried to lose weight. There is little point in asking people who've never attempted weight loss about their weight loss activities. We also wanted them to have completed a weight loss attempt, have some sense that they'd finished, they'd got to where they wanted, or they'd given up and stopped for another reason, because we wanted people to reflect on things that happened afterwards, such as regain. Our sample were broadly middle-aged. Their peak BMI in the last 12 months had been into the obese category, and currently most of them were still obese. We got a nice balance of men and women, which you rarely see in weight loss research. Obviously, you tend to see an imbalance where women are overrepresented, so we think our data are particularly valuable from this perspective, as well as many other. Looking at the strategies that they'd used on a very broad level, we see that the majority hadn't used any professional support at all. So 60% of people reported that they didn't seek professional help, and they didn't necessarily even use a textbook or an online resource. These are people who would never normally have been captured by traditional weight loss research, which tends to be centred around commercial providers or online resources such as NHS Choices in the UK. And we checked to look at the samples we had, and they were indeed nationally representative in terms of their age, their gender, and the regions of the country they lived in. So we can be very confident that the people that we surveyed represented the countries they came from. Of the 2,000 people who took part and who said that they'd attempted weight loss, we found that the vast majority of them had lost at least some weight in their attempt. 108 people tried to lose weight and didn't lose anything at all. We found that of those who reported their weight loss, a fairly surprising 1,310 had lost at least 5% of the body weight or reported doing so, whereas about a third of that number reported weight loss under that level. So this is fairly considerable weight loss. Even if we take into account some over-reporting and we say, consider this might be more nearer 3%, nevertheless, it's significant weight loss being achieved in a population whereby very little actual professional support, as we would think of it, has been provided. Looking at the distribution of the weight loss achieved, this red arrow represents the 5% cut-off, and the mean weight loss reported by participants was 9% of the start weight. And what we see is that a good number didn't lose any, but a sizable proportion achieved what we would think of as clinically significant weight loss, according to their self-report. Looking at the distribution of the regain, I'll give you a few clues as to what's on this graph. So 100% would represent that the person had come back to exactly the weight they started at. In other words, they lost weight, but then they got back to where they began. This red arrow here shows 5%. In other words, maintaining a weight loss of at least 5% below the start weight. And these folks over here actually gained more than they started with. So you can see that the vast majority of people fall to the left-hand side of that 100% line, indicating that most people either didn't regain extra or kept off what they'd lost. Some people kept off a really very large degree of weight loss. When you look at how everyone did altogether, most people ended up about 2% below their start weight, which doesn't sound much, but actually if people manage to maintain that over the longer term, that can translate into meaningful differences in health. So, I'll take you through the slide. We've begun with a little bit at the top where we rule out those who didn't lose any weight at all, and we've gone to those who lost 5% or more versus under 5%. If we look at those that lost 5% or more, a number of people didn't regain any weight, but the majority regained some. However, the vast majority did not get back to where they started. If we look at those who lost under 5% of weight, a small number didn't regain. Most regained some, but the biggest proportion regained all of the weight that they had lost. Bearing in mind that when we say predicting, this is a cross-sectional study, and therefore we mean predictors, as in factors associated with weight loss maintenance here. You can see from this table, well, first of all, positive coefficients represent a correlation with regain. So if we look down this table of which we've got the covariates we controlled for in the blue block, we see that individuals who lost more weight in kilograms tended to regain more in raw kilograms. And you expect that because if somebody makes a very large weight loss, there is more scope to regain a lot of weight. It doesn't necessarily mean that they get back to where they started. So we expect to see that pattern. Also, the duration of regain, the longer people had since they stopped their attempt, the more that they regained. In other words, over time, people regain more and more weight. And again, you'd expect to see that. We also looked at unique predictors within a model that looked more closely at features of the attempt. So here we have, at the bottom, certain strategies that they'd use to try and maintain their weight. And here we have characteristics of their eating behaviour, loss of control and binge eating, and also the experience of having regained a little bit of weight during the weight loss attempt, but kept going anyway. And what we found is people who'd had a little bit of regain during the attempt itself actually did better at maintenance in the long term. In other words, those that experienced a degree of failure or difficulty actually did a lot better when it came to longer-term maintenance than those who didn't report having had any regains at all. We can speculate this might be due to the fact that if you've had a regain, you keep going through it, and maybe you've got some strategies to get back on track. These will stand you in better stead in the longer term when it comes to your maintenance activities. Individuals who had loss of control over eating and binge eating were less likely to maintain their weight over the longer term. Individuals who used strategies for weight loss maintenance, limitation of certain foods and the use of smaller meals were more likely to keep weight off. And I do apologise for the absence of a minus symbol there. I always spot a typo during the talk, and that's mine. In other words, the use of these strategies was correlated with improved weight loss maintenance. Overall, however, when we look at the amount of variance it contributes to the first block, and those elements account for vastly more variance than the additional behavioural elements that we identified. In other words, although they were significant, the actual contribution to overall maintenance was relatively minor. So to summarise what we found, because it's easier to look at this than look at regression table, let's be entirely honest. We found that people who experienced at least one small regain during their previous weight loss attempt did better. People who didn't have binge eating or feelings of loss of control when they were eating did better. People who limited their meal size and avoided certain types of food in order to maintain weight loss, not with the intention of weight loss, but with the intention of keeping weight off, seemed to do better. However, age, gender, and weight loss history were not significant predictors in our model. Neither was country, which we entered into the first block. So UK, Portugal, and Denmark did not vary in the weight loss maintenance achieved by the representative population samples. Income and education were also found not to be predictors of weight loss maintenance. It's also worth mentioning that quite a few weight maintenance strategies appeared to be highly correlated with maintenance. Although we've picked out these ones as they work best in the model, it would be my considered view that people who were trying to do anything to keep weight off, anything reasonably sensible, tended to do better than people who reported doing nothing to try and keep weight off, wanting to do so perhaps, but not necessarily translating that into behavioural measures to keep it off. So essentially, we have people who are perhaps more engaged with the idea of maintenance and who understand the need to shape behaviour in a way that predisposes maintenance to happen. This is the first ever representative general population survey focused on overweight and obese Europeans. The rest have either been clinical samples, community samples, or of people of all weights, or specialised samples of those that aren't representative. It's weight loss in the wild as much as we can get it. We know the data will involve some over-reporting, under-reporting. We know it's not as clean as objectively gathered weight and height data. However, if we want to learn more what people actually are doing rather than what people are doing in RCTs and weight loss control registries, then we need to start asking them and accept the fact that we have to take into account this inaccuracy in individual self-reporting. We saw really quite high levels of weight loss reported, and at least partial maintenance achieved by the vast majority of those that lost any weight at all. And the cross-sectional associations that we've identified as novel in the regression analyses may suggest useful targets for the longitudinal study that is the third part of our work package, and may suggest useful behavioural targets for intervention development. Thank you.
We are a little bit over time, but if there's one short question, we can take it now. All right, let's just take that one. Just please wait for the microphone.
Monique Robon, France. I'm surprised you didn't mention physical activity, which is very important for weight maintenance.
Yeah, we asked people about the physical activity they were engaged in, both for weight loss purposes and weight loss maintenance. However, self-reported engagement in weight loss or weight loss maintenance was not a significant predictor of actual or self-reported weight loss maintenance. Thank you for that question.
Thank you very much, Liz. And let me now call Kirby Sainsbury to the stand. Kirby is also from Newcastle and will be sharing some of the results we have from the qualitative investigations we've done in relation to the role of emotion regulation on weight loss maintenance, and also interactions with motivations and behavioral self-regulation. So please go ahead, Kirby.
Thank you. Oh, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to be talking specifically about some of the qualitative work that we've done in relation to emotion regulation. So the NoHoW toolkit has 4 arms. One is a control arm. One is an emotion and stress regulation arm. The third one is self-regulation and motivation, and then the fourth one combines emotion regulation with motivation and self-regulation. And so that's the reason that we're focusing here on emotion regulation. So this is the definition of emotion regulation that we were looking at. So it's the ability to recognise, understand and accept emotions, to control impulsive behaviours and instead act in line with long-term goals, even in the presence of negative emotions, and to flexibly apply emotion regulation strategies to modulate emotional responses in order to meet such goals. So you can see that that definition overlaps a bit with self-regulation. It's the self-regulation of specifically emotions. When we look at emotion regulation in relation specifically to eating behaviours and weight, what we're usually kind of thinking about is this definition of an emotional eater, so somebody who uses eating as a way of managing their emotions. So a little bit about previous research into the relationship between emotion regulation and weight. So it's been found that people with poorer emotion regulation skills tend to experience poorer weight outcomes, so they have higher BMIs to start with, and if and when they engage in weight loss, they're less successful. Specifically in the context of obesity, emotion regulation has been linked to binge eating. Problem with this research is that it's largely conducted in samples of people who have binge eating disorder. And what we know is that although binge eating disorder is relatively common in obesity, more so than in general population, and higher again in people with obesity who are seeking weight loss treatment, subclinical binge eating, so exhibiting the behaviours associated with binge eating disorder, but that wouldn't necessarily meet diagnostic criteria, but may well still be driven by emotions. There are lots of reasons people binge eat, and one of them is emotions. So there's a bit of a gap there. The clinical obesity maintenance model is a psychological model that explains or tries to explain some of the factors that predict why obesity is still a problem. So this problem of weight loss maintenance, people are able to lose weight, but most people regain weight. And emotion dysregulation, I'm not going to go into the model, but emotion dysregulation is one of those factors. And then in a couple of previous interview studies, emotion-focused coping, which is one element of emotion regulation, differentiated women who had maintained their weight loss versus those who had relapsed. So in general, we know that there's quite a lot of support for motivation and self-regulation when it comes to weight loss and weight loss maintenance. There's a little bit of evidence suggestive that emotion and stress regulation is going to be relevant as well, but that's kind of where the gap was coming into this. We knew less about the emotion regulation side of things than the motivation and self-regulation. And then when it comes to combining those two things, we really need to be able to understand the interaction between these in order to work out how do we combine these strategies and present them to people in a way that's cohesive and seems like they kind of go together so that they can make use of both sets of strategies. So the aims of our qualitative research was to summarise the ways in which emotions and emotion regulation influence people's weight loss maintenance efforts, and then to characterise both the between and within participant variability in how those emotional experiences interact with and, we hypothesise, potentially undermine otherwise good motivation and self-regulatory capacity. Interviews were conducted in all 3 countries, but today, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to be presenting the UK data. So these were people who had successfully lost at least 5% of their body weight following a deliberate weight loss attempt and were currently attempting to maintain that loss. We developed topic guides around the key themes that we were interested in, so motivation and self-regulation, so that we could look at the interaction between those things and emotions and emotion regulation. And we coded and analysed the data. So from the UK, we had 22 participants. At the time that we interviewed them, they were currently between 75% and 105% of their pre-weight loss weight. So thinking about that figure that Liz put up, some people had maintained their weight loss, whereas others had regained all plus a little bit more. Compared to their baseline weight, which was 12 months prior to the point at which we interviewed them, 8 people had maintained within 2 kilograms, 9 people had regained more than 2 kilograms, but most of them were still below their starting weight, and 5 had gone on to lose further weight, which isn't uncommon in weight loss maintenance trials. You tend not to find what we would call sort of a true maintainer. People have lost enough weight to come into a weight loss maintenance intervention, but actually their intention is further loss. Very, very briefly going through what came up in relation to motivation and self-regulation, just to put in context the emotional stuff. We found that people reported both event-based and health-based motivations, and the people who reported event-based motivations tended to need a little bit more support when it came to maintenance, because obviously once the event has passed, that no longer acts as a motivator. One thing that was not really expected was a lot of people used self-regulation of physical activity to motivate themselves. So men in particular would sign up to these huge long cycle races. They'd sign up to things like the Great North Run, marathons, those sorts of things, and set themselves these goals, and they used that as a way of continuing to motivate themselves. And of course, as you would expect, motivation fluctuated. In relation to self-regulation, people mentioned needing to plan meals or plan the shopping so that they only had available healthy ingredients. Preparing meals in advance for times that would otherwise be a risk for lapse, so knowing you're coming home late, tired, stressed, having something pre-prepared is helpful. A lot of the behaviours had become habitual at the point at which we interviewed them. People also talked about this idea of a planned lapse. So in contrast to weight loss, where you're fairly rigidly sticking to a diet, being able to say, well, this weekend I'm going away and I'm not actually planning on sticking to my diet, but having tight controls around that so it doesn't turn into a relapse. And people were engaging in regular self-weighing, which they found helpful. This is the model that we were using, the sort of lens that we were looking at the data through. So it's a clinical model. I'm not going to go into it in huge detail, but it's fairly intuitive. So on the one hand, we have our emotion mind, which is where our emotions are driving our behaviours, and on the other hand, we have our rational mind, which is more fact-based, rule-based, that kind of thing. And looking at people's responses, without us having told them about this model, we could quite clearly see this support. So people who we sort of categorised as being more in their emotion mind said things like, I know I stress, I eat, so basically seeking comfort, it's an emotional thing. Whereas at the other extreme, we had these people saying, well, no, I'm quite logical at things, I don't really ever feel like I've just got to eat and eat and eat. Okay, looking at some of the ways now in which emotions tended to drive eating behaviour. On the one hand, we had this, what we've labelled eating off plan. So people have a plan and they might break that plan, but the way in which they break that plan is relatively minor. And there was a theme that came through here was this idea of I just needed something. I just needed some chocolate. I needed the Yorkshire pudding on Sunday. But the way in which they break that plan isn't what we would call binge eating. It's a little bit extra, not something they'd intended on eating, but probably, if well managed, isn't going to lead to regain. And you can see that all of the people that brought this sort of thing up had either maintained their weight or lost further weight. There was then a pattern where people had a plan and then just made a conscious decision to abandon that plan. So, for example, here we've got a man saying, I came in, my wife said, what do you want for tea? I'd already thought to myself what I wanted earlier that day, and it was something reasonably healthy. Just turned around and said, we'll go to the chip shop. So something emotional happens and people consciously say, no, I'm not doing that anymore. I need the comfort. And there were quite a few examples of that. And as you can see, all of these people, this one maintained, but the other two who were engaging in that sort of behaviour had regained. Then we had the more classical binge eating. So I'll really start a binge and I'll just eat loads and loads. Food makes me happy. Examples of eating 20 chocolate bars, a couple of family bags of chocolate peanuts. Chocolate tended to feature quite heavily in these descriptions. So these are people who we didn't measure binge eating, but probably would be meeting criteria, at least for that subclinical binge eating. And you can see, again, that 2 out of 3 of these people, there were more examples of this, but most people who were engaging in this sort of behaviour had tended to regain weight. In terms of the reactions to the lapse, so how they managed, whether we're talking about a binge eating lapse, just eating something a little bit off plan, so sort of a subjective overeating, or whether it was that abandoning of the plan. There's a lot of quotes here. The reason I've put up so many is because they were just so similar, to the point where I was reading through the transcripts thinking, I'm sure I've already coded this one, and having to go back and make sure I'm not recoding the same transcript that I've already coded. So there was a real theme here of, okay, that's done, tomorrow's another day, back on plan, get beyond it. And as you can see here again, the people that were describing this sort of pattern tended to have either maintained their weight loss or had lost further weight. So in these people, the lapse tended to motivate recovery from that. So having lapsed, they then came out of it thinking, well, I've done that now I've got to get back on track. And they were able to rely on their self-regulation and the habits that they developed in terms of healthy eating to ensure that they did get back on track, and obviously successfully so, given that they had maintained their weight. There was then a pattern here where we've got people sort of talking about guilt. So on the one hand, these are both people who had regained, and here there's this, I really was wishing that I hadn't done it. So in this instance, she's still getting back on track. So that'll be it for the next week or so, the next few days. Still getting back on track, but if it's only for the next few days, that's potentially why this person regained. We've then got an example of somebody who talks about having a plan, but you'll notice here she says, I pick myself back up, don't feel guilty about it, I just need to get past the bit in the middle where I have the stuff I shouldn't, get straight to the plan and the way of moving forward. Actually, what she's talking about here, though, is a plan for how to manage the trigger of the eating as opposed to how to manage the recovery from the lapse. And again, in both of these instances, the lapses that they were describing tended to be more significant lapses. So there were people who were engaging, sort of abandoning that plan, engaging in binge eating. And again, depending on the frequency, you can be really good at recovering from a lapse, but if that lapse is happening every second day, it's still going to have a negative impact on your weight. Then we've got more of that sort of emotional theme coming through. So this is where a lapse really, in a lot of cases, led to a relapse. So after I've calmed down, I'm feeling really guilty. And then over here, a fairly typical what we would think of as an emotional eater, somebody saying, well, if I've had cake and coffee, I think that's it, ruined, and I just use it as an excuse to eat a load of rubbish, and so it continues. So here, the lapse and the guilt associated with that lapse actually undermines the motivation, and they either abandon self-regulation or just don't have a plan for how to get back on track. and this leads to a bit of a spiral. These people also tended to report quite a lot of negative self-judgment, emotional coping, and that they're the ones that are really ending up in this spiral. People talked about a range of different emotions, and what I've done is put them on a little bit of a continuum from our more sort of rational mind along to emotional mind. So on the one hand here, we've got boredom, which debatable about whether or not it's an emotion, but it was something that came up when we asked about this. And in these instances, people tended to be reasonably rational about it. So they would say, well, I was craving something, but if there was nothing available, it didn't really matter. I just got on and did something else. Snacking or picking in relation to boredom didn't tend to be associated with a loss of control, and often a healthy alternative would suffice. It was just that they wanted something to do. It didn't need to be the chocolate. We've then got sort of stress, just feeling generally sort of mentally exhausted. And these were the situations in which, although it is an emotion driving the change in eating behaviour, it tended to be a conscious decision to lapse. It also was associated, stress in particular, was associated with a bit of a belief that I'm going to feel better afterwards, and often people did report feeling better afterwards. And so it had this sort of functional nature. I'm feeling really stressed, I can't really focus, I'll eat the chocolate, and then I put boundaries around it, and now it's actually allowed me to refocus and get back on with it. And the key bit for success here tended to be, are there boundaries around that lapse, and do they have a plan for recovering and getting back on track? And then more at the emotional end, we've got the more typical kind of feeling upset, feeling sad, feeling down, and this is where you get the urgency, the loss of control. It tends to be a larger amount. It's associated with unhealthy choices, so eating a carrot stick isn't going to suffice when these sorts of emotions are driving the eating behaviour. And people often reported actually going out of their way to get food, whereas at the boredom end, people said, well, if there was nothing available, it just didn't bother me. These people would actually go out of the house and go and buy chocolate. Positive emotion also came up, but it tended to span. Sometimes it was rational. Sometimes it was sort of in the middle where it was a planned lapse and people had a plan for a recovery. And then at the emotional end, even if it was a positive emotion that had driven it, people ended up in that same spiral because of the negative self-judgment after having engaged in a lapse. Just a few additional, I said that we wanted to look at the within and between participant variability. So although what I've presented here is sort of people who were emotional, people who were more rational, there were lots and lots of examples of people describing previous emotional coping where now they'd been able to sort of overcome that and make a more considered decision. And the different coping tended to depend on the situation or the emotion. So some people would experience lots of different emotions, but depending on what the emotion was, they acted differently. A lot of people had undergone sort of major life events, so parents going into nursing homes, dying, that kind of thing. And we were really surprised that actually people didn't describe, they described emotions in relation to this, but not emotions that then prompted a lapse. It tended to be thinking more of the practical side of that kind of thing. So just a few conclusions and implications for the toolkit. We went into this expecting that not everybody would fall at this kind of emotional eater end of the spectrum, and we definitely got support for that. So in terms of the toolkit, what we've kind of fed back is that in the emotion regulation arm, we can't just deal with this emotional eater because people experience emotions and the way in which they impact on behaviour differently. Different mechanisms via which different emotions can impact eating. So sometimes there's this functional kind of thing where people believe they're going to feel better afterwards, and it actually allows them to get on with things rather than it always being this urgent loss of control type experience. And as we expected, emotions and poor emotion regulation skills can undermine otherwise good self-regulation and motivation, and therefore needing to think about how do we combine these things in the combined arm. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirby. We have space for one question after this presentation as well. Nick, please wait for the microphone.
Thanks. You sort of alluded to it, but I'm always curious about the stability of this sort of the research findings. Have you or have people ever gone back 4 months later to the same cohort and see how much they've changed or stayed the same?
Sort of is the answer to that question. So the participants that we interviewed were participants who were actually engaged in another weight loss maintenance intervention, and we interviewed them at the end of that time. So some of them reflected on change, but obviously it's self-reported change as opposed to us observing that. But we haven't interviewed them again, but we do have follow-up data in terms of questionnaires. So we've not looked at that yet, but potentially we'll have the ability to triangulate some of this.
Thank you very much.